here's the sermon time part 2. It starts with the Bible reading, which this morning we're hearing from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. Well, really at least his third letter, but the very first one was lost to history. So this one is called 2 Corinthians, and it's from chapter 12, the beginning of it. He's in the middle of saying something, and this is where it picks up. I must go on boasting, however useless it may be, and speak of visions and revelations from God. I know someone who 14 years ago was caught up in the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. Only God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. This man was caught up into paradise and heard unspeakable things of which no human being may tell. About such a man I will boast, but about myself I will not boast, except as regards my weaknesses. You can sort of hear in the whole first part of that how he's really struggling not to say it's me, but here he's going to say, I'm not going to boast about all of this stuff. I will boast only about my weaknesses. And if I choose to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will be speaking no more than the truth. I refrain in case anyone should credit me with more than she can see in me or hear from me, because of the marvelous character of the revelations. For this reason, to prevent my thinking too highly of myself, there was a thorn sent to pierce my flesh, some sort of suffering, an instrument of Satan to discipline me, so that I should not think too highly of myself. 3 times I prayed to Jesus about this, begging that it might leave me, but he replied, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, then, will I boast all the more of my weaknesses, so that the strength of Christ may overshadow me. That is why I delight in weakness, ill treatment, hardship, persecution, and difficulties when born for Christ. For when I am weak, then it is that I am strong. This is God's good news. The first time I saw a rat up close, it was jumping out of our kitchen sink. We were young newlyweds living in a 12-foot wide row house in Kensington. Kathy and I, not the rat and I was standing in the doorway between the dining room and our kitchen, having just flipped on the light to investigate a strange noise. The rat leapt out of the sink basin and down between the sink and the wall. I screamed high-pitched and unrepeatable words, and I grabbed a running shoe as my first line of defense. The second time I saw a rat up close and in person, it was that same one. It had made its way upstairs, most likely through the vents. I lifted the bed skirt under the bed to investigate a strange noise we'd heard from underneath. The rat darted out and ran into the bathroom across my bare feet. I screamed high-pitched and unrepeatable words. Our next door neighbors were 2 sisters who went to the same little church we did. They were well into their 80s and had been in their house for longer than we'd been alive. Caroline and Leona. They'd grown up somewhere north in coal country, but had long since become urbanites. They heard of our travails and said, we've never had a rat in our house. The judgment on our housekeeping skills was only implied, not stated. But wouldn't you know it was not very long before they had an unwanted visitor too. Caroline walked into their bathroom and found herself alone. So she shut the door, she shut herself in, and her voice rang out loud and clear, Leona, bring me the baseball bat. There's a rat in here. Rats don't get a lot of love. People think they're dirty and mean. You can see them skittering around the tracks of the Broad Street line sometimes. I guess they favor the dark when there are people around. They can seem to overtake urban areas where food sources are plentiful. For a while, they were even blamed for the bubonic plague that killed some 25 million people in Europe in the 1300s. Then the theory shifted that it wasn't really the rats that caused it, but they carried the fleas that spread the disease. More recently, scientists have come to believe that rats were only one of the hosts for those deadly fleas, and that most were spread actually by humans. Still, rats don't get a lot of love. For lots of folks, they trigger the horror and disgust reflex. They're also, or can be, heroic. Last month, NPR ran a story about Magawa, who is a Tanzanian-born African giant pouched rat. Just saying that kind of makes me shiver a little. Tanzanian-born African giant pouched rat. In 2020, he received a gold medal from a British charity for life-saving work. I'm sure he was thrilled. This year he retired and will go to a rat retirement home where he'll have good food and will get to play for the rest of his days. That will be a big change from the past 5 years. Magawa has been working in Cambodia, where he has been part of a program run by a nonprofit that trains rats to sniff out landmines. While they're being trained by their human companions, the rats get food rewards for finding targets, for walking across particular surfaces, and then for telling the difference between the scent of an explosive versus some other smell. Wow. Once they know what they're doing, they work really quickly. So they can cover a patch of ground that would take a person 2, 3, or even 4 days of painstaking work in half an hour.
Oh, wow.
Their eyesight is terrible, but they have an excellent sense of smell, and they're too light to trigger a landmine. So when they find something, they scratch the surface above it to signal to their human partner. Magawa has been particularly prolific. In his 4 years of active work, he has covered 2.4 million square feet, which is something north of 55 acres. And he's found 71 landmines and 38 pieces of unexploded ordnance, each of which could have claimed human life or limb. That's remarkable work from a creature that makes people shriek in fear and shudder with revulsion. It is, we might even say, God's work. Of course, it's work that would be entirely unnecessary were we humans not so good at creating devices meant to destroy and maim. Cambodia is littered with landmines and other ordnance left from some 3 decades of civil war and international conflict, most in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Our nation is one of the guilty parties. Some of those explosives came from us. In 1999, a global treaty banning the use of landmines came into effect. There are some nations who have not signed onto it still. We are among them. And there is still hopeful news. The Cambodian government thinks that the project of removing the landmines will finally be completed in 2025, but that comes only after decades of death and injury. I'm struck by the contrast. If you believe the old story, humans are the pinnacle of creation. And while we've got some amazing accomplishments, we have all too often turned our abilities and our ingenuity against ourselves and against the world we live in. Rats, on the other hand, rats are helping to save lives. My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. This is where I was thinking this week. That's the sentence that came to Paul as he tried to pray away his own frailty. Power made perfect in weakness. It's an interesting conviction to sit with on this holiday especially. Weakness is not among the virtues that our nation extols. It's not an ideal you'll find on display in the parades rolling down main streets around the country or in the colorful explosions that paint the sky. It's not something you'll hear much about in the dominant forms of Christianity that try to bend public policy and other people's gender identities and ways of loving to their will. Self-mastery is something you'll hear about, and independence, technological prowess, military muscle, chest-thumping bigness, and self-sufficiency, the freedom to act without constraint or restraint, rockets, red glare, and bombs bursting in air. But what hides in plain sight is in this day's paeans to strength and might are that these are the very principles and practices that animate patriarchy and heterosexism, that undergird white dominant culture, that decimate the planet. So today, I choose to meditate on Magawa, to consider the reviled rat, to reflect on power made perfect in weakness, the disadvantages of small size and poor eyesight that are paired with a keen sense of smell, quick study, and ability to work in partnership to do life-saving work. Grace manifest in creatures that make many of us recoil. Maybe there's an invitation in that for us, more broadly, to notice our own limitations, to notice our own fragility. Not, I don't mean this, not to celebrate the pain that we live with, but to notice that the points where we struggle and need help can also bear unexpected gifts, like a community that actually expanded when we all started having to shelter in place. When we recognize that we need each other is when spirit is most alive among us. And this is God's good news. Amen.